My name is Molly Martin, and I'm 35 years old. If you've ever been humiliated by your own blood and want to witness justice, served cold, hit like, subscribe, and comment Bondaris with your city below. I want to know who is listening, because to understand how my sister ended up holding that envelope, I have to take you back to a version of my family that I still believed in. You think I cheated, Karen? I didn't even get to answer before my sister slid the DNA envelope across the Easter Sunday dinner table toward my husband, smiling like she'd waited 3 years for this exact moment. Not think, Molly. I know. Lark's blonde hair doesn't match Nolan at all. You've been lying to him for 6 years. Today, everyone finally sees what kind of woman you really are. My sister, the one who had always proudly called herself the real biological Boyd daughter, smirked like she had just successfully destroyed my entire life. She had absolutely no idea that the bomb she brought into that dining room wasn't meant for me at all. It was meant for her. And when my husband finally reached page 4 of that report, the truth she had spent 38 years hiding would finally explode directly in her face. Let's just pause for a second. Pull up a chair, grab your coffee, and let's talk about this. If you've ever watched someone smile while trying to pull the rug out from under your life, you know the exact temperature of the room in that moment. The air goes completely out of the space. My sister Karen wasn't just trying to share information. She was performing an execution. We were sitting at my mother's dining room table, surrounded by the white china with the thin gold band that only comes out for holidays. The condensation was dripping down the sweet tea pitcher, making a tiny puddle on the lace tablecloth. And there Karen was, leaning forward, her eyes bright with a kind of manic energy that she wanted everyone to mistake for righteousness. She had spent a total of $149 on a consumer relationship test, completely convinced that she had bought the ultimate weapon to erase me. But see, as an emergency room nurse, I've spent over a decade trained to be a watchful person. In a trauma bay, rooms full of chaotic, bleeding people are actually easier to read than a family dynamic. Patients don't lie with their bodies. If someone is crashing, their stats tell you the absolute truth in real time. My family, on the other hand, had been lying with their bodies, their words, and their silences for 35 years, and I had simply never stopped to look at the chart. I was trained to absorb the hits, to be the secondary character in their grand narrative, and to stay quiet so the golden child could shine. But as I sat there watching the heavy manila paper scratch against the tablecloth as she slid it toward Nolan, my chest didn't catch fire. It went entirely beautifully cold. I looked at my husband, whose large hands were resting flat on either side of his plate. And I knew. Whatever trap Karen thought she had built, she had forgotten to check the foundation. To truly understand how we got to that dining room table, you have to understand the geography of where we grew up. Nixa, Missouri isn't the kind of town people move to. It's the kind of place people come back to when they've run out of other options, or when the rest of the world gets a little too loud to bear. It's a community of about 24,000 souls, tucked tightly between Springfield and the deep, rolling hills of the Ozarks. We have a couple of stoplights, 3 Baptist churches, and 1 lone quick trip on Highway 160, where every long-haul trucker cutting a path between St. Louis and Tulsa stops for black coffee at some point in his career. My father, Curtis Boyd, was one of those truckers for 31 long years. He lived his life in a 3-week rotation, hauling freight across state lines, leaving a trail of diesel smoke and empty kitchen chairs behind him. And while he was conquering the interstate, my mother, Adele, worked the grueling breakfast shift at the Nixa family diner. She stood on her feet from 1985 until her knees finally gave out entirely in 2018, pouring coffee for the regulars, wiping down laminate counters, and baking pies before the sun even thought about coming up. In a town like Nixa, everyone knows your business. Or at least they think they do. Secrets here don't usually die. They just hibernate under the floorboards, waiting for the right season to rot through the wood. But back in January of 2026, I still thought the story we were living was the one we had consciously chosen. I was living in a state of carefully constructed ignorance. If you've ever been the child who had to learn to read the subtle shifts in a room's temperature before you even learned to speak your mind, type the word sex and sick in the comments right now. Let me know how many of us are out there. Because that was my role, the backup child. I was born in September of 1990, exactly 21 months after my older sister, Karen. From the absolute day I was brought home from Cox South Hospital, my script had already been written by someone else. Karen was the primary protagonist of the Boyd family. She was the firstborn, the one who had already been christened with elaborate family heirlooms, meticulously photographed from every conceivable angle and neatly catalogued in heavy leather scrapbooks. She was the one our uncle, Wayne Keller, had handpicked a giant stuffed rabbit for before she was even out of the womb. I, on the other hand, was the surplus daughter. I was loved, certainly, fed, clothed, and tolerated, but I was never the main plotline. When my father came home from his grueling 20-day stretches on the road, his entire universe shrunk down to Karen. He didn't see the quiet, watchful girl sitting on the linoleum floor. He saw his golden girl. He came home to her crude crayon drawings, proudly displayed on the refrigerator, and to the weekend fishing trips to Table Rock Lake that were exclusively arranged for Karen and Uncle Wayne. Wayne had all the time in the world to teach Karen how to cast a line, how to gut a base, and how to command a room, but he had absolutely none left over for me. I remember asking my mother once, when I was just 6 years old, if I could please go out on the boat with them next time. I wanted to feel the spray of the water, too. I wanted to hear my father laugh the way he did when Karen caught something. My mother didn't even look up from the dish towel she was folding. She just sighed and said, "You wouldn't like it, honey." And just like that, the door was shut. Karen came home that very afternoon, holding a 2-pound largemouth bass, grinning like largemouth bass, grinning like a little queen, with Wayne's heavy arms slung casually around her shoulder while my dad took the picture. Do you know what I got that afternoon? A generic dollar store coloring book. I was paid in cheap paper and wax crayons to stay out of the way of their happiness. I didn't realize until much later that I was being systematically trained to accept the crumbs of my own life, while my sister was conditioned to believe she owned the entire table. That fishing photo on the living room wall stayed in its faux oak frame for decades. Karen, age 8, freckled and grinning, holding her prize while Uncle Wayne Keller stood proud behind her. I look back now, and I realize my body understood the rot in that house long before my brain did. There were 2 baptism photos sitting side by side on my mother's upright piano. In Karen's 1989 photo, Wayne Keller was standing directly behind her as her official sponsor. In my 1991 photo, it was Pastor Bradford's wife. Standing in that exact spot, a woman I had literally only met twice in my entire childhood. When I was 10, I finally gathered the courage to ask my mother why Wayne was Karen's godfather, but wasn't mine. She just stared out the window and whispered, "Wayne's been through a lot, honey. He needs a break from all this." 10-year-olds accept the stories adults hand them because we don't yet know that grown-ups use silence to hide the things that would break them. The family dynamic solidified into a concrete law. At Karen's 30th birthday party back in 2018, my father stood up at a Longhorn Steakhouse in Springfield, raised his glass high, and toasted her as my boy girl, the one who stayed. I was sitting literally 3 feet away from him, my hand tucked firmly inside Nolan's. My father didn't include me in the toast, and he didn't correct his slip of the tongue. He didn't have to. Nolan just squeezed my fingers under the table and stayed silent. Nolan knew exactly what my father hadn't said. I was the backup daughter who had married the Martin boy and moved away, while Karen was the keeper of the sacred family name. But I didn't turn bitter. I turned observant. I became an emergency room nurse because a room full of bleeding, chaotic people is profoundly honest. My family had been lying with their postures for 3 decades, but when I met Nolan, I finally found baseline sanity. Nolan is a large animal veterinarian who operates on an unyielding schedule of quiet logic. He doesn't explain things twice, and he doesn't play emotional games. When our daughter Lark was born in January of 2020, she arrived with hair so incredibly pale and fine it looked like spun silver under the harsh delivery room lights. Nolan's hair is dark brown, mine is chestnut. His side is all red-cheeked Irish stock, and mine is sturdy German farming lineage. Neither of us expected a striking porcelain blonde. Except there was a completely logical reason. My great-grandfather, Elmer Boyd, had immigrated from Kaiserslautern in 1923 and stayed shockingly blonde until he turned 50. That recessive gene simply skipped my grandfather, skipped my father, traveled through 3 generations of silences, and landed squarely on my daughter. Lark's pediatrician, Dr. Iverson, took one look at her during her 2nd week of life, glanced at the chart, and asked, "Any blondes on either side?" I told her about Elmer. She nodded once, scribbled a note, and moved on. That was the absolute last time I thought about my daughter's hair color for 4 years. I didn't realize that, while I was busy saving lives at Mercy Hospital, my sister was sitting in her empty house, staring at my beautiful daughter and turning a harmless strand of silver hair into a psychological weapon. The real trouble began at Christmas of 2025. Karen's own life had been rapidly fracturing. She had gotten engaged at 29 to a man named Jared Whitmore, only to call it off 6 months later. Then she tried again at 34 with a paramedic named Colin Redfield, dragging that one out for 18 agonizing months before dismantling it too. My mother told everyone in Nixa that it was simply because Karen had impossibly high standards. But the raw truth was that both of those men had eventually figured out her fatal flaw. Karen couldn't sit next to someone else's hard-earned peace without desperately wanting to redistribute it. My quiet, stable happiness with Nolan had officially become her target. It actually started back at Thanksgiving in 2023. Lark had just turned 3 and was toddling happily around the living room in a pair of denim overalls. Karen watched her with a cold, unblinking intensity, and then, right in front of the entire family, she dropped her first vial of poison. "Nolan, you ever think Lark looks more like Molly's side or someone else's side?" The entire room stopped moving. My father kept eating his turkey like a machine, and my mother stared fixedly at the pumpkin pie she was slicing. Nolan set his fork down slowly, looked at my sister for 8 unblinking seconds without uttering a single word, and then calmly reached for another slice of pie. I thought that was the end of it. In reality, it was just the opening salvo. Through 2024, Karen systematically shifted her strategy. She stopped confronting me and started calling Nolan directly under the flimsy pretext of asking complex veterinary questions about her neighbor's aging dog. But every single phone call inevitably veered toward Lark, always ending with a sharp, passive-aggressive phrase like, "Has she ever asked you why she looks so completely different from the rest of us?" Nolan never told me about those calls at the time. He didn't want to disturb my peace while I was pulling double shifts at the hospital. Instead, he quietly began building a folder on his phone entirely labeled CB. By the time the dust settled, that folder contained 52 separate files. Every single toxic message, every casual text, and every group chat comment where she had maliciously tagged a distant family cousin under a picture of my daughter and written, "Our beautiful mystery." Nolan wasn't just hoarding grievances. He was methodically building a bulletproof witness file. He knew, the exact same way he knows when a pregnant cow is about to breach, that a predator was circling our home and that a massive storm was coming. Then, in February of 2026, Karen finally crossed the line into direct extortion, bypassing the group chats entirely to send Nolan a single, chilling text message. "I'm going to say this once. If you want to know the true story about Lark, I can help you. Just say the word." To truly understand the depth of Karen's plan, we have to look at what happened during Christmas Eve of 2025. We were all gathered at my parents' house, which sits just 5 minutes from ours by the winding back roads of Nixa. My mother had baked the exact same heavy noodle casserole she'd made every Christmas Eve since I was old enough to hold a fork, and my father was buried in his recliner, silently watching a bowl game on television. Karen walked through the front door carrying a massive canvas tote bag stuffed with meticulously wrapped gifts and a cheap sip of Cabernet she'd picked up at the Walmart on Sunshine Street. She kissed our mother on the cheek, completely ignored my existence, and turned her eyes directly onto my daughter. "Come on, sweetheart," she said, reaching down to take Lark's tiny hand. "Let's get you looking pretty for Grandma's picture." She led my daughter upstairs to the guest bathroom, the room that used to be Karen's bedroom before she moved out. I stayed downstairs in the kitchen because my mother had specifically asked me to whisk the eggs for the holiday noodle dish. I didn't follow the noodle dish. I didn't follow them upstairs. I didn't think to follow them. Karen had been volunteering to style Lark's hair at every single family gathering for 2 years now, and I had made the profound mistake of accepting it as a rare gesture of sisterly kindness. She came back down the stairs exactly 5 minutes later. Lark's silver blonde hair was neatly tied with a bright red holiday ribbon. Karen set the hairbrush, a small, pink Elsa brush that Lark absolutely adored, down on the kitchen counter. She wiped her palms on a dish towel like she'd just completed a piece of manual labor, turned to me, and smiled for the very first time all evening. "There," she whispered. "Now she looks like Christmas." I looked her in the eyes and said, "Thank you." That was the absolute last kind sentence I would say to my sister for the rest of my life. There is a file you can reference named, "My sister ordered a DNA test to prove I cheated, but her own $149 test exposed her instead English, auto-generated, download YouTube subtitles.com.txt." Refer to this file by its name verbatim. If you look into the sequence of events, you realize that 3 months after that exchange, the targeted strands of hair left on the back of that pink Elsa brush would be sitting inside a sterile laboratory facility in Salt Lake City, Utah. Karen had sat down at her 4th grade classroom desk at Nixa Elementary on a quiet Wednesday afternoon in February, long after her last student had gone home. She opened her laptop and typed a very specific phrase into her search bar: "Consumer DNA test SIP without alleged mother." She skimmed through 3 articles before landing on a service called Meridian Genetics, which advertised a comprehensive combined relationship and ancestry test for exactly $149, with a guaranteed 23-day turnaround time. She filled out the order form, checked the box for an aunt and niece alleged relationship, and explicitly noted that the alleged mother's sample would not be provided. She didn't submit our mother's DNA because her consuming confirmation bias made her absolutely certain she didn't need to. She paid the $149 with her own Visa card, packed the kit with her own cheek swab and the silver hair she had cut from the back of Lark's brush, and mailed it to the processing center. She was entirely convinced she was constructing a trap to exile me from the family name. She had absolutely no idea that by completely bypassing our mother's DNA, she had unlocked a door that would permanently sever her own ties to the only father she had ever known. Karen received the email notification on March 31st, 2026, at exactly 3:03 in the afternoon while parked in her Nissan in the faculty lot at Nixa Elementary. She opened the attached PDF document on her phone in the dim front seat, her eyes racing straight to the top-line summary. The text read, "Genetic relationship consistent with half-sibship testing recommended. Secondary sample alleged aunt is not a full sibling of child's parent." She stopped reading the moment her eyes hit the words half-sibship and not a full sibling. Her blinding confirmation bias completely hijacked her ability to process basic English. She interpreted the sentence the exact way a desperate woman who has already decided the ending of a story interprets a sentence. In her mind, the report was screaming that I had cheated, that Lark was not Nolan's full biological child, and that I was finally caught. She actually laughed out loud in the empty parking lot. The very next morning, she drove straight to the FedEx office on Sunshine Street and printed out the entire 4-page report. She didn't bother to read pages 2, 3, or 4. She simply stuffed the document into a manila envelope, sealed the metal clasp, and hid it at the bottom of her navy blue tote bag, waiting 5 agonizing days for Easter Sunday. Which brings us right back to that dining room table. The tension in the room was a living thing. My mother was frozen at the head of the table, holding a stack of gold-rimmed china, sensing the disaster before it even broke. Karen leaned over and slid the envelope toward my husband like a dealer sliding a card. "Today, everyone finally sees what kind of woman you really are," she sneered. Nolan didn't flinch. He set his fork down with the slow, terrifying precision of a vet handling a scalpel. He looked across the table at Karen, giving her one final, unmerited chance to save herself. "Karen, before I open this, you just told a room full of family that my wife has been unfaithful for 6 years," he said, his voice dropping into a low, steady register. "Are you absolutely sure that's the story you want to be locked into?" "Read it," she barked, her smile completely fixed. She thought he was just buying time. Nolan unclasped the metal fastener, pulled out the 4 pages, and calmly turned to section 2. He didn't look at me. He looked directly at my sister. Then, using the exact same even, clinical voice he uses with clients when he's delivering a fatal, large animal diagnosis they desperately don't want to hear, he began to read the biological data aloud. Shared DNA between subject sample Karen Boyd and secondary sample alleged niece. 12.5%. He paused, letting the numbers hang in the heavy air of the dining room. He looked up, his face entirely unreadable. "Karen, you're a 4th-grade teacher. What does a full aunt share with a full niece?" Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She had meticulously planned for every single scenario, except for someone questioning her literacy. Her fork was still clutched in her hand, and she set it down on the table with a tiny, sharp clink. Nolan didn't wait for her brain to catch up. "A full aunt and a full niece share 25%, he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife through leather. "A half-aunt shares 12.5. This report isn't telling you that Molly cheated, Karen. It's telling you that you and my wife are not full sisters. You share exactly one biological parent, not both." My mother sat down instantly. She had been standing frozen at the head of the table, holding that heavy stack of gold-rimmed china the entire time, but now her knees simply gave out. She set the plates down on the white lace tablecloth so incredibly gently they made no sound at all. Karen's face still hadn't completely fallen yet. Her mind was frantically running backward through the sentence, trying to convince herself that Nolan had just misread the technical jargon. She lunged her hand across the table, her fingernails scraping the wood. "Give it to me," she demanded. Nolan didn't hand it over. He calmly flipped to page 3. Section 3, Ancestry Markers, he read aloud, his voice steady and clinical. Subject sample is 62% Irish, Munster region, 18% Scots-Irish, 14% English, and 6% German. The ambient noise of the dining room, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock, suddenly evaporated into an absolute, suffocating silence. Nolan turned the printed report around and slid it across the table toward my father. Using the exact same two-finger motion Karen had used 10 minutes earlier. "Curtis, look at the ancestry breakdown on your daughter. The daughter you've been calling the real Boyd for 37 years has exactly 6% German ancestry. Great-grandfather Elmer Boyd was full German. He came off that boat from Kaiserslautern with all 4 grandparents from the same region. A full Boyd granddaughter would test in the high 40s for German, at an absolute minimum." My father did not pick up the document. He just stared at the ink on the white paper. His weathered face turned the color of old ash. Then his eyes slowly drifted up to look at my mother before dropping back down to the percentages. He muttered one low, gravelly sentence that broke the room completely in half. "Wayne was Irish. Keller, Munster." My mother's tears started then. She didn't sob out loud. She didn't cover her face with her trembling hands to hide from us. She just sat perfectly upright at the head of her own holiday table, behind that pile of dirty plates, and cried the specific way a woman cries when she has been bracing herself for this exact day for 38 long years. It was the kind of weeping that has no sound because it has been fully rehearsed in total silence during 1,000 sleepless midnights. My father didn't scream. This was a man who had famously raised his voice at me until the windows rattled for accidentally slamming a screen door back in 2004. But he didn't raise his voice at his wife of 43 years now. He was simply too tired to carry the anger. The truth was, he had been carrying the unspoken possibility of this secret longer than he had ever let himself admit out loud. He looked at her and said her name just once, Adele. Was it Wayne? She didn't look up to meet his eyes. She just nodded her head once. Nolan calmly turned to page 4, and his voice didn't shake a bit as he delivered the final blow. Cross-reference indicates the subject's Irish Munster markers are fully consistent with the Keller line profile. Submitted for genealogy comparison in 2018 by Wayne Keller of Springfield, Missouri, now deceased. Confidence. Parental. The word parental landed on that lace tablecloth like a heavy porcelain plate dropped from a ceiling height. It didn't physically shatter anything in the room, but the impact instantly changed the gravity of our entire lives. Karen finally understood. Her entire face went completely slack as her manufactured identity collapsed right in front of her cousins, her mother, and the man she had called Dad her entire life. She lunged across the table, frantically yanking the printed pages out of Nolan's hands. Her fingers were shaking so violently that the paper rattled like dry leaves in the wind. She stared down at page 4, reading the word parental over and over again before looking up at my husband with wide, terrified eyes. She uttered a sentence I didn't think her pride was capable of. "Nolan, please. Please don't say another word." He didn't have to. The truth was already sitting comfortably at the table. My father stood up slowly, placing both of his heavy, weathered hands flat on the wood to steady his weight. He was 67 years old, and I watched him age 5 more years in the 8 seconds it took him to find his footing. Then he did something he hadn't done in 2 decades. He walked completely around the table bypassing his weeping wife and ignoring the golden daughter who was no longer a boy. He walked straight to my chair. He reached down and placed his hand on my shoulder. It was heavy, and it was shaking just a little bit. "Molly, take your daughter home," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of 35 years of a mistake. "Take your husband. I need to sit with my wife." For my entire life, I had been the second name in every sentence spoken in that house. I was the afterthought, the surplus child. But with one sentence at his broken Easter table, my father made me the only name that mattered. He didn't soften it or follow it with anyone else's. He looked at me as his true daughter and asked me to protect what was mine. I stood up, gathered Lark from the family room where she was playing, and walked out into the April afternoon. Behind us, the old Missouri screen door closed with its familiar, slow squeak and a quiet thump, leaving the secrets exactly where they belonged. In the months that followed, the fallout reshaped everything. Karen submitted her resignation to Nixa Elementary on April 14th, packed a tiny 5x8 U-Haul trailer, and drove 165 miles up to Kansas City to disappear into a new life. She kept the key to Wayne Keller's old 40-acre cabin, a piece of land worth over $200,000 that he had left exclusively to her in his will because she was, as the text revealed, his only biological child. She didn't sell it and she didn't visit it. She just kept the key on her ring like a physical scar. My mother writes me a short letter on a yellow legal pad every 2 weeks, detailing her therapy sessions and her quiet days. I read every single one, but I haven't written back yet. I am in no hurry. Healing takes the time it takes. But my father comes over to my house every single Monday afternoon now. He pulls his Ford Ranger into the driveway, sits on our back porch, and teaches my 6-year-old daughter Lark how to bait a fishing hook. There is a beautiful, aching symmetry to watching him teach my daughter how to fish, the exact same way Wayne Keller once taught the daughter my father thought was his own. I just sit back with my coffee, look out at the yard, and let it happen. Some truths only stop being lonely when someone else finally hears them. My sister paid $149 to prove that I wasn't who my family thought I was, and she was right about the wrong person. For 35 years, I believed I owed my family an apology for simply existing in the background. It turns out I owed them absolutely nothing. It turns out that the only name worth keeping is the one your husband, your daughter, and your father call you when they are standing on your porch on a quiet Monday afternoon. My name is Molly Martin. I am somebody's real daughter now, and I am entirely done apologizing for not being someone else's.